What happens when a weapon looks so wrong that even elite American operators can't believe their eyes? When a rifle breaks every rule in the book, but dominates every battlefield it touches? Today, we're diving into the story of a gun that made Navy SEALs and Delta Force operators question everything they thought they knew about modern combat. Picture this: Afghanistan, 2006, a dusty compound in Shah Wali Kot. American Rangers are watching their Australian allies prepare for a dawn raid, and something is seriously off. The Aussies are carrying rifles that look like they're from a science fiction movie, magazine behind the trigger, barrel so short it seems impossible. The whole thing screams wrong, dangerous, amateur hour. The Americans are thinking one thing: these guys are about to get themselves annihilated. But here's the twist that nobody saw coming. Those weird-looking rifles, they were about to rewrite the entire playbook on close-quarters combat. They were about to prove that everything the world's most advanced military thought it knew about weapons design was incomplete, and the men carrying them. They were about to clear that compound in 6 minutes flat, without a single flashbang, without a single breach charge, moving through rooms so small that American operators couldn't even imagine fighting in them. And this is the untold story of the F88 Austeyr, the Bullpup rifle that American Special Forces operators secretly requested to carry instead of their own weapons. The gun that made Taliban fighters fear the bearded ones more than airstrikes. The weapon that looked like a mistake but turned out to be a prophecy. We're talking about design choices made in the 1980s that perfectly predicted the warfare of the 2000s, about a rifle so compact you could transition from vehicle to firefight in under 5 seconds, about engineering so smart it kept working when every other coalition weapon was jamming in the Afghan dust. And here's what nobody tells you. While everyone was celebrating American tactical superiority, while the world was watching Navy SEALs dominate headlines, there were quiet operators with strange rifles doing things that made even Delta Force stop and take notes. Things that violated every principle of American combat doctrine, things that worked so devastatingly well that U.S. units were filing requests to adopt Australian weapons and tactics. But this story gets darker, because 13 years in that desert did something to the men carrying those rifles, something that all the reliability and engineering brilliance couldn't fix. We're going to explore how a perfect weapon can be wielded by imperfect humans pushed beyond their breaking point, how efficiency in warfare can become a curse when there's no end in sight. Stay with me, because what you're about to discover will change how you see modern combat forever. We're pulling back the curtain on coalition warfare's best-kept secret. We're revealing why American operators were trading their M4s for captured Austeyrs. We're showing you the weapon that looked like the future because it understood the present better than anyone else. The F88 Austeyr, the rifle that shouldn't have worked but became legendary. This is its story, and trust me, by the end of this video you'll understand why one American Ranger, after 3 brutal deployments, gave the simplest, most devastating explanation for switching weapons. It fits. Stick around, this gets wild. The first thing you notice is the sound. Not the crack of gunfire, not the roar of engines, but the absence of something familiar. When an American operator chambers around in his M4, there's a metallic click everyone recognizes. When an Australian SASR trooper does the same with his F88 Austeyr, the sound is different, sharper, alien, like a surgical instrument snapping into place rather than a weapon being loaded. It's 2006 Shah Wali Kot district, and a U.S. Army Ranger is watching an Australian commando check his rifle before a dawn raid. The weapon looks wrong to American eyes, too short, too futuristic. The magazine sits behind the trigger guard instead of in front of it, giving the whole rifle a science fiction profile that seems out of place in this medieval landscape of mud compounds and ancient irrigation ditches. The Ranger has been in country for 4 months. He's seen British troops with their SA-80s, Canadians with their C-7s, Germans with their G-36s. Coalition warfare means a gun show of NATO standardization, but this thing, this bullpup monster with its integrated optic and almost comically compact silhouette, it looks like it was designed for a war that hasn't happened yet. What he doesn't know, what none of the Americans knew in those early years, is that this strange-looking rifle would become one of the most effective close-quarters battle weapons in the entire Afghan theater. And the reason had nothing to do with firepower or accuracy, it had everything to do with space. But that revelation was still hours away, buried in the pre-dawn darkness of a compound raid that would rewrite American assumptions about weapon design. The F88 Austeyr entered Australian service in 1988, replacing the venerable L1A1S LR that had served through Vietnam. The name itself was a marriage of geography and engineering. F for rifle, 88 for the year of adoption, Austeyr as a portmanteau of Australia, and Steyr, the Austrian company that designed the original AUG platform. What Australia purchased wasn't just a license to manufacture, it was permission to evolve. Thales Australia, the defense contractor responsible for production, didn't simply copy the Austrian original, they adapted it, modified it, made it meaner. By the time Australian troops were rotating through Afghanistan in the early 2000s, the F88 had gone through multiple iterations. The version that became iconic in the dust and heat of Helmand and Uruzgan provinces was the F88 SA2, also known as the Enhanced F88 or EF88 in its final form. The weapon's most distinctive feature was its bullpup configuration. Unlike conventional rifles, where the action and magazines sit in front of the trigger, the Austeyr placed them behind it. This wasn't just aesthetic choice, it was physics solving a fundamental problem of modern warfare. How do you maintain a full-length barrel for velocity and accuracy while keeping the overall weapon short enough for vehicle operations and close-quarters combat? The Americans had answered this question by chopping down their M16S into M4 carbines, shorter barrels, more maneuverable, but with reduced muzzle velocity and effective range. The Australians went a different direction entirely. Keep the full-length barrel, move everything else backward. The result was a weapon that measured just 790 millimeters in overall length while maintaining a 508 millimeter barrel. For comparison, an M4 carbine with its stock extended measured 840 millimeters with a barrel of only 370 millimeters. The Australian weapon was shorter and more powerful simultaneously. It was a free lunch in a field where every advantage came with a compromise. But the real genius wasn't in the dimensions. It was in what those dimensions enabled. The Shah Wali Kot raid was textbook until it wasn't. Intelligence indicated a Taliban commander using a compound as a way station for fighters moving between Pakistan and Kandahar. The plan called for a joint U.S.-Australian assault. Rangers would establish outer cordon, SASR would hit the main structure, standard coalition choreography. The vehicles rolled out at 0300 hours. American Humvees, armored and imposing, paired with Australian Bushmasters, the massive six-wheeled MRAP variants that had become synonymous with Australian operations. When the convoy halted 200 meters from the target, the dismount sequence revealed the first crucial difference. American Rangers emerged from their Humvees in a practice flow, but it was never graceful. The vehicles were designed for protection, not ergonomics. Operators had to angle their rifles, duck their heads, perform a small ballet of movement to exit without catching equipment on door frames or roof edges. It took seconds, but in combat, seconds accumulate into vulnerabilities. The Australians simply stood up and stepped out. Their Bushmasters had been modified with rear crew compartments designed around the Austeyr's dimensions. The compact bullpup profile meant operators could sit facing outward, weapons held at ready, and simply rise when the vehicle stopped. No weapon manipulation, no adjusting of slings. They transitioned from protected to deployed in a single fluid motion that looked almost lazy in its efficiency. One of the Rangers muttered something about it looking easy. His team leader, a veteran of Fallujah, didn't respond. He was watching the way the Australians moved, and something about it bothered him in a way he couldn't articulate. They didn't look like soldiers preparing for combat. They looked like workers arriving at a job site. The approach was silent, no radio chatter beyond essential navigation calls. The Australians had a reputation for what U.S. forces called negative comms, saying nothing unless absolutely necessary. It drove American officers insane during joint planning sessions. How do you coordinate with an element that refuses to confirm receipt of orders? But here, in the dust and darkness, the philosophy revealed its purpose. Sound carries in desert air. A radio squelch at the wrong moment can compromise an approach. The Australians trusted their planning enough to require no further discussion. The brief was the brief. Everything else was execution. They reached the compound wall at 0322. The breach point was a wooden door, old and weathered. held closed by a simple metal latch. The American way would involve a shotgun breach or explosive charge, overwhelming force establishing immediate dominance. The Australian approach was different. One operator simply kicked the door. The latch snapped, the door swung open, the team flowed inside, and here, in the cramped interior spaces of an Afghan compound, the Austeyr's design philosophy proved its worth in ways that surprised even experienced observers. Afghan compounds are not built for warfare. They're built for extended families, for agricultural storage, for keeping animals separate from living spaces. This creates a labyrinth of narrow passages, low doorways, sudden corners, and irregular rooms. American tactics, developed in the wider streets and larger buildings of Iraqi cities, required constant adaptation. The M4 carbine, already shortened from its M16 parent, still measured over 2.5 feet of weapon protruding in front of the operator. In a narrow corridor, that length becomes a liability. It announces your presence around corners. It catches on door frames. It creates a moment of exposure before you can bring the weapon to bear in a new room. U.S. doctrine addressed this through speed and violence of action. Move so fast the disadvantage doesn't matter. Throw flashbangs. Overwhelm the space. The Australians didn't need to. Their weapons simply fit the environment better, and Austeyr's profile extends only inches beyond the operator's hands. The barrel doesn't lead the way into a room. The operator does. This sounds like a minor distinction until you watch it in action. An American rifleman entering an Afghan room leads with roughly 2 feet of steel and polymer. An Australian with an Austeyr leads with his eyes and muzzle simultaneously. The weapon appears in the room at the same moment as the man carrying it. The tactical implications are profound. In close quarters battle, the first person to acquire and engage a target usually wins the encounter. Milliseconds matter. The difference between your barrel clearing a doorframe before your eyes versus your eyes and barrel arriving together is measurable in fractions of a second. In aggregate, across dozens of room entries, those fractions accumulate into significant advantage. The Shah Walikot compound had 11 rooms across 2 structures. The SASR element cleared it in 6 minutes and 40 seconds. No flashbangs, no breaching charges beyond that first kick door. Just methodical, silent movement through spaces that seemed designed to favor defenders, but somehow didn't. The American Rangers holding outer cordon heard almost nothing. A few muffled cracks of suppressed gunfire, a shout in Pashto, cut short, then silence, then the radio call. Compound secure, 4 enemy eliminated, 1 detained, negative friendly casualties. When the Rangers entered for post-assault documentation, they found something that would feature in their after-action discussions for months afterward. The rooms were small, absurdly small by American standards. One sleeping chamber measured roughly 8 feet by 10 feet. With the ceiling so low, the Rangers had to duck. There were bullet impacts on the walls, close groupings suggesting controlled fire rather than panic spraying, and they tried to imagine clearing these spaces with their M4s, with their kit, with their tactics. They tried to envision moving through these constricted passages with weapons designed for different environments. It was possible, certainly. They'd done similar operations in Ramadi and Mosul. But it would have been louder, slower, messier. One ranger photographed a doorway that measured barely 2 feet wide. He stood in it with his M4, demonstrating how the weapon's length forced him to angle it diagonally just to fit through. Then he asked an Australian operator to do the same with an Austeyr. The Bullpup slid through the opening perpendicular to the operator's chest, ready to fire the instant he crossed the threshold. The photograph never made it into official reports, but it circulated through military forums and training units for years afterward. It became a visual argument in debates about weapon design that continue to this day. But this was only one aspect of the Austeyr's adaptation to Afghanistan. The other advantages were less immediately obvious but equally significant. The Bullpup configuration placed the chamber in action directly against the operator's shoulder. This proximity to the body's center of mass made the weapon naturally more stable during the movement. An M4's center of gravity sits well forward of the shooter, requiring muscular tension to keep the muzzle oriented properly during walking or running. The Austeyr's balance point aligned with the operator's core, reducing fatigue during extended patrols. In a war where operations routinely lasted 8, 10, 12 hours from infill to exfil, this mattered. Tired muscles miss targets. Tired muscles shake. The difference in fatigue between carrying a properly balanced bullpup versus a conventionally configured carbine might only be 5 or 10%, but that percentage could mean the difference between a first-round hit and a miss at hour 11 of a patrol. The standard F88 SA2 came with an integrated 1.5 times magnification optic. This was modest by American standards, where ACOGs with 4 times magnification had become standard issue, but the Australian choice revealed a different priority. Lower magnification meant wider field of view, faster target acquisition at close ranges, and less reliance on perfect eye relief. In the type of sudden close-range engagements that characterize compound raids, a wider field of view beat higher magnification. For longer-range work, the F88 incorporated a Picatinny rail system that allowed attachment of more sophisticated optics. Australian forces in Afghanistan routinely mounted thermal imagers, night vision devices, and variable power scopes depending on mission profile. The weapon became a platform rather than a fixed system, adapting to operational requirements in ways that honored both close quarters and precision engagement needs. But adaptation wasn't just about mounting hardware, it was about environmental survival. Afghanistan destroys equipment. The dust is talc-fine and invasive, working its way into every crevice and moving part. Temperature swings from near-freezing nights to 40+ Celsius days create expansion and contraction cycles that crack seals and loosen fittings. The sun's ultraviolet radiation degrades polymers and plastics. Rain, when it comes, arrives as torrential downpour that floods wadis and turns everything into clinging mud. Weapons that function perfectly in temperate climates seize up, jam, or break in this environment. The early years of Afghan operations were filled with small disasters, optics fogging, stocks cracking, finishes wearing through to bare metal that rusted almost immediately. The Austeyr, in its original Austrian configuration, wasn't immune to these problems. Early Australian deployments reported issues with the standard green furniture cracking under thermal stress, magazines becoming difficult to seat when dust accumulated in the well, and the standard barrel finish wearing through after months of use. Lethality Australia responded with modifications specific to deployed feedback. The furniture polymer was reformulated for better temperature tolerance. Magazine wells were redesigned with tighter tolerances and easier cleaning access. Barrel finishes were upgraded to more durable coatings. By the time the enhanced F88 variant reached Afghanistan in 2009, it had been refined through thousands of hours of field experience into something uniquely suited to the theater, and the weapon's chromium-lined barrel proved particularly valuable. Unlike some competitors that use different treatments, the Austeyr's barrel maintained accuracy even after sustained firing in dusty conditions. Australian troops reported being able to fire hundreds of rounds in a single engagement without significant degradation in point of impact. This reliability became legendary among coalition forces, particularly after incidents where other nations' weapons failed during critical moments. One such incident occurred during Operation Slipper in 2010 when a joint Australian-Dutch patrol was ambushed in Uruzgan province. The engagement lasted over 3 hours, with Taliban fighters using a tree line and irrigation ditch network to maintain sustained fire. The Dutch troops, armed with Diamaco C7 rifles, began experiencing stoppages after the first hour as fine dust contaminated their weapons' actions. The Australian element, smaller in number but equipped with F88s, maintained continuous effective fire throughout the engagement. Dutch soldiers later reported seeing Australian operators brushing dust off their weapons between magazine changes, but never stopping to perform remedial action for malfunctions. The guns just kept working. This reliability wasn't accidental. The Austeyr's gas system, inherited from the Steyr AUG, utilized a short-stroke piston design that vented gases away from the action rather than directing them back through the bolt carrier group like the M4's direct impingement system. Less gas in the receiver meant less fouling, which meant longer intervals between malfunctions. In an environment where every minute counted and stopping to clear a jam could be fatal, this engineering choice had life or elimination implications. But reliability is only valuable if paired with lethality. And here, the Austeyr's 5.56mm NATO chambering became subject of endless debate. The 5.56 round has been controversial since its adoption, lighter than the 7.62 NATO it replaced, easier to carry in quantity, with less recoil allowing faster follow-up shots. but also less powerful at range, more susceptible to wind drift, and with marginal terminal ballistics that led to countless arguments about stopping power. In Afghanistan, where engagement distances routinely exceeded 300 meters, the 5.56's limitations became apparent. Taliban fighters armed with 7.62 Kalashnikovs could fire effectively from ranges where coalition 5.56 weapons struggled to achieve reliable hits. This spawned a minor renaissance in designated marksman rifles and 7.62 battle rifles across coalition forces. The Australians addressed this through doctrine rather than hardware. SASR elements routinely included SR-98 sniper rifles in 7.62, NATO and SR-25 and 308, Winchester Magnum for long-range precision fire. Infantry sections incorporated F89 Minime light machine guns, also in 5.56 but with longer barrels and sustained fire capability. The F88 filled the middle ground, adequate for most engagement distances, optimized for the close-range work where most casualties actually occurred, and complemented by specialized systems for edge cases. This combined arms approach revealed sophisticated understanding of weapon system employment. The Austeyr wasn't expected to do everything, it was expected to do its specific job extremely well, while other systems covered its weaknesses. In practice, this meant Australian infantry could engage targets out to 400 meters with the F88, but anything beyond that distance became a job for specialized marksmen or machine gunners. The weapon's lethality at typical engagement ranges was never in question. The 508mm barrel generated muzzle velocities around 930 meters per second with standard M855 ammunition, enough to defeat most soft cover and light barriers. The Bullpup configuration's longer barrel, compared to M4 carbines, translated to roughly 50 to 70 meters of additional effective range. Not a dramatic difference on paper, but meaningful in practice. Australian troops reported consistently good results with the F-88's accuracy. The weapon was capable of 2 to 3 minute-of-angle groups with quality ammunition, meaning it could reliably place rounds within a 4 to 6 inch circle at 200 meters. For combat purposes, this exceeded requirements. The average engagement distance in Afghanistan was measured in dozens of meters, not hundreds, and at those ranges the Austeyr's practical accuracy far exceeded what most shooters could exploit under stress. But accuracy means nothing if the weapon isn't where you need it when you need it, and this brought the design philosophy full circle to its original virtue, compactness. Australian operations in Afghanistan frequently involved vehicle-mounted patrols. The Bushmaster MRAP became iconic of Australian presence, but the vehicle presented challenges for troops transitioning between mounted and dismounted operations. The interior was cramped, filled with communications equipment, ammunition stores, water supplies, and the personal kit of 6 to 8 operators. Space was at premium. American troops dealt with this by securing their rifles in vertical racks or laying them across laps during transit. Neither solution was ideal. Racked weapons required seconds to retrieve and ready. Weapons on laps shifted during vehicle movement, had to be controlled during rough terrain, and complicated rapid exit. The Austeyr's length allowed Australian troops to hold their weapons in a high ready position even while seated in the vehicle. The compact profile meant the muzzle didn't extend into another operator's space, the stock didn't catch on equipment, and the weapon remained immediately accessible. When the vehicle halted and rear doors opened, operators exited with weapons already oriented toward potential threats. This capability was demonstrated repeatedly during Taliban ambushes of Australian convoys. The preferred insurgent tactic was to hit vehicles with RPGs or IEDs at close range, then immediately engage with small arms fire during the confusion of the initial blast. The goal was to catch coalition troops still inside their vehicles or in the vulnerable seconds of dismounting. Australian casualties in such ambushes were notably lower than coalition averages, and after-action analysis consistently cited the speed of Australian response. Operators were returning effective fire within seconds of initial contact, often before the ambush element had fully committed to their attack. The Austeyr's ready accessibility played measurable role in this response time. One particular engagement in Kora Valley, 2007, became case study in vehicle-to-dismount transition. An Australian patrol of 3 Bushmasters was engaged by approximately 20 Taliban fighters using a classic L-shaped ambush, RPG strike from the front, machine gun fire from the right flank. The lead vehicle took an RPG hit to the front armor, disabling the engine but leaving the crew compartment intact. The crew exited in under 5 seconds. 5 seconds from explosion to boots on ground, weapons oriented, beginning to return fire. American advisors reviewing the incident footage noted this was roughly half the time similar U.S. units required for emergency egress. The difference wasn't training or skill, it was equipment designed around operational reality. But the Austeyr's contribution to Australian operations went beyond pure functionality. The weapon became symbol, identifier, psychological tool. In a coalition environment where most forces carried variants of the M16 or M4 platform, the Austeyr's distinctive profile made Australian troops immediately recognizable. Taliban fighters learned to identify the odd-shaped rifles and the men who carried them. Intelligence reports from captured insurgents repeatedly referenced the bearded ones or the shotgun men, descriptions that matched Australian SASR operators with their relaxed grooming standards and bullpup weapons. This recognition came with reputation. Australian special forces in Afghanistan developed mythos among both coalition partners and enemy forces. Stories circulated of silent raids, of compounds cleared without explosives, of operators appearing from impossible positions. Whether these stories were entirely accurate mattered less than their effect. The Taliban learned to fear the Austeyr's profile because it signaled the arrival of troops who fought differently than conventional forces. This psychological dimension shouldn't be dismissed as mere legend. Modern warfare includes significant information and perception components. An enemy who expects certain tactics can be disoriented by different approaches. An enemy who has learned to fear specific units will sometimes break contact or surrender rather than engage. The Austeyr became part of Australian identity in theater, and that identity carried weight. But identity comes with cost, and the Afghan deployment tested more than equipment. By 2012, Australian forces had been rotating through Afghanistan for over a decade. Some SASR operators were on their 4th or 5th deployment. The toll was measured not in dramatic statistics, but in accumulated stress, in relationships strained by absence, in the 1,000-yard stare that became common among veterans of repeated rotations. The Austeyr remained mechanically reliable, but the men carrying it showed wear that no maintenance schedule could address. There were incidents, investigations, questions about whether the pressure of sustained operations had pushed some operators beyond acceptable boundaries. The weapon didn't change, the users did. Equipment can be designed for durability, tested for reliability, refined through feedback. Human endurance follows different mathematics. The same traits that made Australian Special Forces effective in close-quarters raids, the willingness to operate in silence and isolation, the comfort with violence in confined spaces, these traits could become liabilities when there was no decompression, no rotation home, no respite from the expectation of lethal efficiency. The Austeyr appeared in photographs from this period held by men whose eyes suggested they'd seen too much. The weapon remained crisp and functional in their hands, while they themselves looked worn and hollow. This dissonance became uncomfortable for observers who'd celebrated Australian tactical innovation without considering the human cost of sustained deployment. There were no scandals directly tied to weapons or tactics, but there were questions about whether the very efficiency that made Australian operations successful had also made them sustainable beyond healthy limits. Can you clear too many compounds, conduct too many raids, maintain operational tempo too long? The Austeyr kept working, some of the men carrying it did not. These concerns remained largely internal until later investigations brought them to public attention, but even during the peak of operations there were signs that something was fraying at the edges of Australian excellence. Yet the weapon itself remained exemplary. As Australian forces began drawing down from Afghanistan in 2013, the F88 Austeyr had compiled a combat record that military analysts would study for years. Reliability in extreme conditions, effectiveness in close-quarters battle, adaptability across mission profiles. It had proven every design choice that initially seemed unusual to American eyes. The legacy extended beyond Australian service. Other nations examined the Bullpup configuration with renewed interest. British forces, already using the SA-80 Bullpup, felt validated in their choice. French troops took note of the Austeyr's performance for their famous replacement discussions. Even American Special Operations units, traditionally conservative about weapon selection, began experimenting with captured or borrowed Austeyrs to understand their advantages. Several U.S. units requested permission to adopt the F-88 for specialized roles. and these requests were generally denied due to logistics and supply chain concerns, but the fact they were made indicated significant shift in perception. The weird Australian rifle had become the rifle other professionals wanted to carry. The technical community took notice as well. Weapons designers studying next-generation infantry rifles incorporated lessons from the Austeyr's Afghan performance. The value of compact length with full barrel performance became accepted wisdom. The importance of balance and center of mass and reducing operator fatigue entered design specifications. The need for environmental durability moved from afterthought to primary requirement. By the time Australia began fielding the F88, the fully enhanced version of the Austeyr in 2014, many of its innovations had been validated by over a decade of combat use. The F88 refined rather than revolutionized, better ergonomics, improved rail systems, enhanced reliability. But the core philosophy remained unchanged: compact, reliable, lethal. The weapon that had looked futuristic in 2006 now looked prescient. Its odd proportions made sense once you understood the environment it was designed to dominate. The Bullpup configuration wasn't aesthetic choice or engineering curiosity. It was solution to a specific set of problems that Afghanistan had highlighted with brutal clarity. Coalition forces learned this lesson slowly, mission by mission, compound by compound. The Australians had simply understood it earlier, committed to it more completely, and refined it through thousands of hours of the hardest training ground imaginable: actual combat against a determined enemy in unforgiving terrain. But perhaps the most significant legacy was the quietest. The Austeyr changed how coalition partners thought about weapon selection, not as pursuit of perfect universal solution, but as matching specific tools to specific requirements. There is no one best rifle. There are only rifles optimized for particular contexts, and the skill lies in understanding which context you're operating in. For Australian troops clearing Afghan compounds, moving through tight corridors, transitioning between vehicles and foot patrol, engaging at typical combat distances in dusty, brutal conditions, the F88 Austeyr was optimized almost perfectly. It wasn't the most powerful rifle in theater. It wasn't the longest ranged. It wasn't the most modular or most customizable. It was simply the best tool for the job Australian forces were being asked to do, designed around the realities of that job rather than abstract specifications or doctrinal preferences. And in the end, that pragmatism proved more valuable than any amount of theoretical superiority. The last Australian combat troops left Afghanistan in late 2013, though some advisors remained for another year. They took their Austeyrs with them, weapons now worn from years of use, but still functional, still reliable. The rifles had outlasted the deployment, outlasted the mission objectives, outlasted some of the men who'd carried them. Back in Australia, the F88s were cleaned, inspected, refurbished, and prepared for whatever came next. The lessons learned in Afghan dust were incorporated into training, into tactics, into the institutional knowledge that would shape future operations. The weapon became part of the story Australian forces told themselves about their experience in the forever war. For American troops who'd served alongside Australians, who'd watched them work, who'd seen what the strange Bullpup rifle could do in the right hands, the Austeyr represented something more complex. It was a reminder that American ways weren't the only ways. The different solutions could be equally or more valid for specific contexts. That the weird-looking rifle carried by the bearded Australians wasn't just different, but in some important ways, better. This recognition didn't come easily to a military culture accustomed to assuming American equipment represented gold standard. It required the humility of watching allies succeed with tools that challenged American assumptions. It required admitting that compact length and bullpup balance might matter more in compound clearing than the familiarity of conventional rifle layout. Some American operators never accepted this. They continued to insist that the M4 platform was superior, that the Austeyr's advantages were marginal, that Australian success owed more to the quality of their operators than their equipment. This argument contains some truth. Equipment doesn't win wars, people do, but equipment that makes the people more effective, that reduces their fatigue, that fits their environment better, that allows faster transitions and more natural movement, this equipment contributes to victory in ways that are difficult to measure but impossible to dismiss. The ranger from Shah Wali Kot, the one who'd watched that first raid and felt confused by how easily the Australians moved, eventually rotated home and then returned for a second deployment. By his third deployment in 2010, he'd requested and received permission to carry a captured Austeyr instead of his issued M4. He was one of perhaps 24 American operators who made similar choices over the course of the war. His team leader asked him why. After 3 deployments with an M4, after thousands of rounds and hundreds of missions, why switch? The Ranger's answer was simple. It fits, he said, and after you've cleared enough rooms, fit matters more than familiar. This sentiment never appeared in official doctrine or procurement decisions. The U.S. military didn't adopt the Austeyr, didn't shift to Bullpup configurations, didn't fundamentally alter its approach to infantry weapons, but individual operators remembered. They remembered the short rifle that moved through doorways like it belonged there. They remembered the Australians who'd made clearing compounds look easy not through superior aggression but through superior tooling. And they remembered that sometimes the future doesn't look like you expect it to. Sometimes it looks like a weird Austrian rifle modified by Australians and proven in the dust of a war that neither nation had wanted, but both had fought with the tools they'd chosen. The F88 Austeyr story in Afghanistan is ultimately about choices and their consequences. Australia chose Bullpup configuration when most nations were choosing conventional layouts. Australia chose compactness over modularity, balance over accessory rails, proven reliability over cutting-edge technology. These choices were made in the 1980s and 90s, long before Afghanistan became the defining conflict of a generation. But when the war came, when coalition forces found themselves fighting in compounds and corridors and confined spaces that favored defenders, when the limitations of conventional rifle designs became apparent through hard lessons, Australia's earlier choices proved remarkably well suited to the challenge. This wasn't luck. It was the result of clear-eyed assessment of what infantry combat actually looked like, stripped of romanticism about long-range marksmanship or suppressive fire. Most infantry combat happens at distances measured in tens of meters, not hundreds. Most casualties occur in close-quarters engagements where the first shooter to acquire target wins. Most operations involve transitions between vehicles and foot movement, between open terrain and confined spaces, between patience and violence. The Austeyr was designed around these realities rather than around doctrine or tradition. It wasn't perfect, no weapon is, but it was fit for purpose in ways that became undeniable once that purpose was tested against genuine opposition in genuinely difficult terrain. For the men who carried it through 13 years of Afghan operations, the rifle became more than equipment. It became extension of self, trusted tool, reliable companion in circumstances where reliability meant survival. They knew its quirks, its limitations, its optimal employment. They knew how it felt after 8 hours of patrol, how it balanced during vehicle movement, how quickly it came to shoulder in a dark room, and they knew, though they might not articulate it, that they'd been given an advantage their enemy didn't fully understand. The Taliban learned to fear the bearded ones with their short weapons, but they never quite grasped why those weapons were so effective. They saw the results, the cleared compounds and eliminated fighters, but the mechanical reasons remained opaque. This technological edge was small, measurable in fractions of seconds and increments of fatigue, but warfare is a game of margins where small advantages compound into significant effects. The Austeyr gave Australian troops a margin that contributed to their effectiveness and possibly to their survival. As the war recedes into history, as the deployments end and the veterans age, and the lessons learned become institutional memory rather than living experience, the F88 Austeyr remains in Australian service. The EF88 variant continues to equip Australian forces, still compact, still reliable, still optimized for the type of combat that characterized the Afghan experience, even as military thinkers contemplate future conflicts that might look very different. The weapon has become icon not just of Australian military capability, but of a particular approach to military problem solving: pragmatic, unconventional, willing to commit fully to a chosen path even when others doubt it. The same national characteristics that shaped Australia's entire Afghan deployment were visible in miniature in the rifle its troops carried. For American observers, for coalition partners, for military historians analyzing the conflict, the Austeyr stands as a reminder that warfare rewards those who understand their specific circumstances better than those who pursue abstract excellence. The best rifle isn't the one with the highest theoretical performance. It's the one that performs best in the actual conditions where it will be used. Afghanistan was those conditions. Dust and heat and compounds and corridors and sudden violence in confined spaces. The F88 Austeyr was built for precisely this. Even though nobody knew it when the weapon was first adopted, it took a war to prove the design, to validate the choices, to demonstrate that the weird-looking bullpup carried by the Australians was exactly what was needed. That validation came at terrible cost, measured in lives lost and minds strained, and innocence destroyed. Equipment performed while people struggled. Technology worked while humanity frayed. The Austeyr kept firing while some of the men who'd carried it came home broken. This is not indictment of the weapon. It's acknowledgement that no rifle, however well designed, can address the fundamental challenge of asking humans to operate at lethal capacity for years on end without rest or respite or recognition that there are limits to what people can endure. The F88 Austeyr succeeded at its mission. Whether the mission itself was worth the cost remains a question that equipment cannot answer. But for the specific, limited question of whether a bullpup rifle could outperform conventional designs in close-quarters combat in Afghan conditions, the evidence is clear. It could. It did. And the men who carried it proved this thousands of times over 13 years of war. The weapon that looked like science fiction became history. The rifle that seemed too different became standard. The Australian choice that appeared questionable became validated, not through marketing or propaganda, but through the hardest test imaginable. Actual use by actual soldiers in actual combat against an enemy who very much wanted to eliminate them. In that crucible, the F88 Austeyr proved itself worthy, and in doing so, it changed how professional militaries think about infantry weapons, about design philosophy, about the relationship between tool and user. That legacy, built in the dust of forgotten compounds and provinces most people couldn't locate on a map, carried by men whose names will never be widely known, represents the truest measure of the weapon's worth. Not specifications or statistics, but the quiet confidence of operators who knew their rifle would work when everything else was uncertain. The F88 Austeyr was that rifle. Strange-looking, unconventional, perfectly suited to the war, it found itself fighting. A weapon that looked like the future but was actually just the present, properly understood.